Greetings, diners, and welcome to another edition, or actually the second part of this edition of the Shit Hits the Fan podcast or vidcast on the Collapse Cafe. And the same guests that were here with part one on energy are back here for part two on economics. And we have with us Hugo Barty. I'm not going to give everybody's website this time. Hugo Barty is here, Tom Lewis, Steve Ludlam, Norman Paget, Nicole Foss, Munster, and Gail Tverberg, and me, Ari. So we are going to look now at what's going on the economic level in our oncoming or ongoing collapse. And Munster, take it away.
Yep, so in this segment we're looking at the economic systems and how it's used to distribute sources and prevent economic collapse for as long as possible. Specifically, we're going to look at credit markets and shares and how these are being propped up in various means. And the focus in particular will be on China. Now, this is where the most interesting things have been happening recently. They are a big mover in the credit markets. They have a large shadow banking industry, which, as its name implies, is quite opaque. And for many years now, they've been recipients of hot money from the West or so forth, with investors seeking high returns for years. However, recently, the yuan, or renminbi, has been declining in value, and that has made the carry trade with the dollar less favorable. Now, I was just wondering, can currency devaluation help the Chinese? What are your thoughts on that one, Nicole?
Well, I think we probably need to set the stage a little bit before I answer your specific question. China is the largest manifestation of the largest credit bubble in human history that's been inflating for the last 30 years. And China has had an unbelievable blowout of economic development, even more so since the financial crisis in 2008. China redoubled its efforts to develop and build huge, staggeringly huge quantities of infrastructure. To put it in perspective, in 3 years, China used more cement than the United States used in the entire 20th century. So the scale of the infrastructure development has been absolutely staggering. Now, what they've done is overproduce infrastructure because there was no feedback as to what is and is not a productive investment. And there are corruption incentives in the state-owned enterprise sector. So there was a huge incentive to build and build and build, whether or not the infrastructure created was ever going to be of any value to anyone. And a lot of it absolutely won't be. Now, a lot of it was developed at the local government level. Local government was not allowed to borrow from the official banking system. They were forced to borrow in the shadow banking sector. What this has done is created an enormous quantity of private debt, which is exactly what kills economies on the way down. The leverage that takes you so far up kills you on the way down. And private debt will weigh on the Chinese economy for years and years and years. So we're going to see all that infrastructure probably simply fall apart because bubble era infrastructure is typically really badly put together and doesn't last very long. A lot of those ghost cities that have been built will probably never be lived in by anybody. They'll simply fall apart. They'll get concrete cancer, and that'll be that. Same as Japanese bubble infrastructure. If you look at what the Japanese built in the 80s and in their bubble, all of that's falling apart now because there's no demand for these things. This infrastructure has been overbuilt and will never actually serve a useful purpose. But it's consumed gargantuan quantities of resources in the meantime, which is what's inflated the commodity bubble to the extent that it has. Now, China has already been moving into the era where their Ponzi scheme falls apart. It's been going on for the last while. It really began about 3 years ago, but it's getting into the critical phase now, and they're attempting to devalue. They've had a currency peg to the United States dollar, and the problem is that The United States dollar has been rising because there's a flight to safety into the reserve currency, plus there's the deflation of dollar-denominated debt. There's more dollar-denominated debt than any other kind in the world. The attempt to pay down dollar-denominated debt creates demand for dollars. So the U.S. dollar has been going up. Because the Chinese currency was pegged to the U.S. dollar, it's been dragged up with the U.S. dollar. That makes Chinese exports less competitive compared to other emerging markets. So the point of devaluation from the Chinese perspective has been to try and regain the competitiveness vis-a-vis other emerging markets. So it's a better-than-neighbor currency devaluation that is going to spark off a currency war, which will eventually destroy fiat currencies, but not yet. And the US dollar in particular has a lot further to go to the upside, but there's going to be attempts across the board to bring currencies down. We have an economy globally that's so focused on trade, and it's all about being competitive in relation to everybody else. So there are going to be attempts for everyone driving their currency down relative to everyone else, but of course that just creates horrendous confusion in the markets, and nobody's going to be exporting their way out of the bursting of this particular bubble. Now, the scale of debt in China, it's now of the order of 300% of GDP. That's a staggering increase compared to what it had been previously. And that private debt will weigh on the economy for years and years and years. And because what they're going to do in attempting to prop up their economy and keep going, they're going to be flooding the market with, say, steel, for instance. They're going to be dumping all over the world. This is going to put everybody else out of business. If the Chinese production is the lowest cost, then it will drive out production from the rest of the world. So we really are going to see things start to pancake. We're going to see a meltdown in the derivatives market, I would argue. We're going to see a collapse of trade. And we're going to see the end of the era of globalization on a massive destruction of credit as the global Ponzi scheme bursts. Now, as important as energy is, as we were discussing recently, I would argue that we need to focus on economics and finance simply because the impact happens so much more quickly than changes in supply and demand for anything in the physical world. Because finance is virtual, because we've created this enormous quantity of virtual wealth that has no substance to it, we've created a tremendous crisis of under-collateralization. We're effectively playing a giant game of musical chairs where there's maybe one chair for every 100 people playing the game. As soon as the music stops, the people best positioned to understand the rules of the game they're playing are going to grab a chair as soon as they possibly can. Everyone else will be out of the game. So what we're looking at is a gargantuan financial crash. 2008 was the warning shot across the bow, nothing more than that. The main event is still to come, and we are going to remember the next decade at least as an era of acute financial crisis. People will not be thinking in terms of energy crisis or environmental crisis or climate change or anything for a very long time when they no longer have any money in their pockets and they're worried about where their next meal is coming from. The discount rates are going to go through the roof. We're going to be in an economic depression where people are going to lose the luxury of the longer-term view. So the discount rate goes up, meaning people discount the future at a tremendous rate in comparison to the present. You end up with a tremendous shift to even more short-termism than we already have. All longer-term considerations will be out the window under those circumstances. So we're going to be living through a tremendous economic depression. As I said in the previous episode, when you have a huge bubble, you are borrowing demand from the future. Then you have to pay it back, and that's what an economic depression is. So we ended up with this huge blowout over 30 years of credit expansion. Now we're going to have an extreme undershoot in terms of economic activity as all that debt pyramid pancakes, and we're going to be moving into a long-lasting, chronic, deflationary economic depression. So I would argue that this is comparable, as I've said in Hugo's company before, to Dante's Ninth Circle of Hell, which is a frozen lake So the lowest depths of hell are not fire and brimstone. It's a period where nothing moves at all. And that's very much what deflation is going to do. We're going to see trade collapse. We're going to see the velocity of money fall off a cliff. So there'll be much less money in existence anyway. And what there is, people will be hoarding. It won't be circulating in the economy. When you have very little money circulating in the economy, the velocity of money being very low, then you have no lubricant in the engine of the economy. When you try and run an engine with insufficient lubricant, it is going to seize up on you. And that's exactly what we're moving into at the moment. And the other way to look at this is to say we're about to crash the operating system. Finance is the global operating system, and we're going to be doing the equivalent of staring at the blue screen of death for a period of time until we have a chance to reboot the system. And this is likely to take a considerable amount of time. So we have to look at, A, getting through the crunch period where there's going to be very little money around, and then what do we do to reboot the system into a form that looks less like a planet-killing Ponzi scheme?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the whole situation I see, and this is, I feel what people fear is a lot of people see China as the main country that fuels global economic growth. So if their engine splutters, as it were, then that will have ramifications for a lot of people. And then second of all, you know, they were seen as saviors of the previous economic collapse, where all the West was falling apart. China's strong growth sort of helped stem the tide, as it were. But I don't foresee them repeating that feat again. So any crisis is going to be worse. And on top of that, you've got interest rates across the globe at near 0%. So there's no leeway there. Steve, do you want to add to anything that Nicole just stated in that?
Well, she covered a lot of ground, and I'm not gonna really go over it again. But you know, I think one of the things we're kind of working our way into what is money? What is this thing we call money? And you know, you have a credit expansion like we had. You know, all these derivative items. You know, shares and bonds, options, different currencies and whatnot. Anything that's tradable can be considered as money. It has the characteristics, a lot of the characteristics of money. When you start to have the credit contraction, then you know, you want the coin of the realm. You want official government money. Then you want certain kinds of money. Then maybe you want something else. I mean, because basically, money is an abstraction. You know, you want something. Really the issue is what it is you want. Is there any other way that you can function without having this thing that you want? It's all bound up in a narrative, and you know, it's a narrative itself. It's really obsolete. You know, I keep hearing, you know, I heard this whole thing is, you know, get the idea of a bunch of wise men in different panel offices and central banks around the world. Well, we're going to depreciate our currency here 20%, and then they come up with a reason for doing it, and you know, it really. You know, it's a compelling narrative. I mean, you pay attention to it, you get the idea that there are people in charge and that they're running things and they know what they're doing. And like all of this stuff is false. You know, that they're caught up in a whirlpool of events, and you know, part of it is, you know, just the credit expansion can't carry on anymore. We've done everything we possibly can. There's nowhere to go but down. We're at the peak, and there's nowhere to go but down. And you know, but the narrative itself is defective, and we don't really have a grip on, you know, the best way to run this idea of money. You know, it's and I think that's really one of the things that's going to emerge out of this. You know, right now we think the dollar is really great. We've got to get our hands on the dollar for a whole bunch of reasons I can go into. We haven't got time. But you know, why that? Why not something else? And you know, what is the background? You know, what is the narrative? And you know, why is the narrative defective? Because if it wasn't defective, we wouldn't be having the problems that we're having.
Yeah, I would agree there. Like, I think it's hard to see how credit expansion would continue after a next crisis. Like I mentioned before, there's not a lot of leeway when it comes to interest drops. Most people are on 0%. In a few places are even on a -%, like Switzerland comes to mind. And you've got quantitative easing that's coordinated by the central government. So if it's not America doing it, it's Japan or the Bank of England or the Eurozone. So I don't see anything that can increase it from that end. But I was just wondering, is there any, like, Ari, do you have any sort of ideas about how things will go in regards to currency devaluation? Do you have any thoughts there?
Well, I don't want to cover ground that's already been covered, but to look at one side of it is the currency devaluation idea is to make your products more competitive, right, against other people. They become cheaper, and you can sell them overseas. Well, you got two problems with that. First of all, on the other side of it, your inputs, all the stuff that you need to make those products, become relatively more expensive. Anything that you have to import to those things, and that primarily would be energy, right? So as long as the dollar has hegemony and is the primary currency for purchasing oil and energy, then if you devalue your currency relative to the dollar, you're going to have less purchasing power for energy. And energy is what you need to make the products to then export and sell. So it's counterproductive in the end. You can't really sell more products that way. Then your next problem there is the fact that the whole rest of the fucking world is in debt. And who is going to buy your products at whatever low price that you sell them for at every day at Walmart? So devaluing your currency and trying to sell cheaper than your neighbor is not going to work in a world that's saturated in debt. And all the money, of course, that everybody is using is debt. And it is got to be based on something. If you just issue credit but you don't have the materials behind it that credit can buy, then the credit is going to go worthless. The situation is that the very same people that control the energy resource starting in the mid-1800s, basically Rockefeller family and the House of Rothschild and so forth, big banking houses, they control the energy industry. They also issue the credit to buy that energy. So they can issue it out, but unless they have control over the energy resource and the ability to deliver it to market, then any credit that they issue is essentially worthless stuff. And this is what is occurring. All of that money is going worthless because they don't have the material to deliver it. They don't control it. You see what's going on in the Middle East, of course, and the fact that you have basically a nonstop war over the resources, and that war costs money, and that essentially takes away from the EROI of the energy, right? If you're using up energy fighting this war, dropping bombs and killing people in order to protect the oil to then deliver to market, that's an added cost to the whole thing. So when you start to factor those things into consideration, even the cheap oil that's still coming up out of Saudi Arabia, and there isn't much of that left, but there is still some, it's not really cheap because it's coming at the expense of a huge military budget that we have to spend and to keep the oil flowing. So the devaluation of these other currencies, it's a forced devaluation. It goes back to what Nicole writes about. It affects multiple claims against non-existent wealth, which is the non-existent wealth is all the oil that is now CO2 up in the atmosphere, and as Steve has put it in the past, you can't repo it. It is not collateral that is in any way worthwhile. So all this money, all this debt is a meaningless phantom now. The one thing that I guess I will sort of take issue with, Nicole, she phrases stuff that we won't be able to do this for a long, long time in the future. My contention would be we'll never be able to do it again. And certainly not in anywhere near this type of level. The money that we have and the great expansion that we went through of credit was all based on a huge pool of thermodynamic energy that we were able to access for the last 150 years. And in the absence of that pool of energy, which it will be absent for millennia to come, but it will be absent for till the end of the Earth, really, because the amount of time and the particular environment that it took to create that type of fossil fuels simply is never going to exist again. So there will never be those fossil fuels again to retrieve, and so we'll never have that kind of energy level, and as a result, we'll never be able to issue credit to any level near that. Obviously, you can still issue money on lower forms of energy input. Certainly, the Roman Empire issued money, and we will be talking about history aspects later. But the amount of money that you can issue and what it will buy is always dependent upon the energy available to your society. So, devaluation or not, it doesn't matter. The money simply is not going to buy stuff because the stuff won't be there to buy.
So did you want to say something against that, Nicole?
Well, not against it. I would really like to agree that fossil fuels are a once-in-a-planet's-lifetime deal. And so the heights to which we rose this time with turbocharged capitalism with fossil fuels, we will never get there again. There is simply no way. So when I talk about economic recovery, I'm very much relative terms, relative to where we're going right now. There will be something that looks like recovery, but we're not coming back to where we are now. The level of economic complexity that we currently enjoy is absolutely an artifact of high energy profit ratio fossil fuels. And without those, we are not going to have technological civilization. Likelihood is that it will take an extremely long time to recover to anything that looks like empire again. And I would argue that in the absence of fossil fuels, Rome is about where you top out in terms of empire. So that's really where we're going. We're going to be living in a much simpler kind of society. And I would argue there will be credit, though. There'll always be credit. There just won't be technological things high-tech things to buy with it from the other side of the world or anything like that. But there was a derivatives market in Holland in the 1630s over tulips, for instance. So humanity is perfectly capable of generating monetary follies, even in the absence of fossil fuels. You don't need energy to have, you don't need fossil fuel energy to have a bubble. We've had bubbles going back to antiquity, but we aren't going to get this size of bubble again. This size of bubble is an artifact of fossil fuels. We would never have got anywhere near where we've got without that. So despite the fact that finance will be the primary driver to the downside, high energy profit ratio fossil fuels were the primary driver of expansion and developing complexity.
Yeah, so I would definitely agree. Like even in system dynamics, they suggest that complexity is a function of energy available. So if the energy declines, then by extension, society has to simplify. And I also agree with your point that credit will be available in the future, but just at a much lower scale. There's an argument that credit came before money. If you read the book 5,000 Years of Debt, that's a suggestion. But going back to the topic, I was just wondering, does anyone have any views on the currency devaluation? Gail, anyone like to add to that topic?
Well, just to add a little bit, I think, I talk about the network system and how the whole economy fits together. And, here China is trying to readjust its position a little bit. But I see, I think it's very much similar to what the other people have been talking about. But I see the debt and the huge rising amount of debt as being very essential to getting the oil out and getting more of the oil out and more of the coal out. And it's the fact we can't get it up that is causing the problem now. So I see the situation as being, as reverse engineer just said, there is no reset to the current level. Maybe it's like Nicole said, it's too much lower level from where we are, but it's taking little pieces of our network system and trying to build up from them someplace else.
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing just seems unsustainable, and like previous people have mentioned, the currency devaluation is just in the end it's a bit of a zero-sum game. So just hello.
Yeah, I want to just drop in and add one more deal on that, which is insofar as what the availability of credit will be in the future. One of the aspects of our current society, our current civilization, is that the creation of credit has become increasingly more centralized and developed around central banks and, in fact, the Bank for International Settlements, and it's all run on an enormous scale that is very consolidated, very centralized. Credit may in forms be available, but whatever credit is available is going to be on a much more localized, much smaller level. First of all, I don't see it as very likely that the large-scale computer systems that we currently use to push credit around and to manipulate digit money, I don't see those as being perpetuated very long. Once you drop back to a paper level, then your ability to move big numbers and to manipulate markets in the way that are currently manipulated with high-frequency trading and so forth, these things become impossible to do without computers. Credit probably will be in some form available, but again, credit is the ability of one person or a group of people to have control over resources and then offer credit to others to have access to those resources. And that's what money is. It's essentially a form of slavery to people who control resources, and they use it as a means of distributing the resources. So until and unless in a given area some group of people has adequate control over the resources of that area, it's impossible for anybody to issue credit on them. That is the function of a organized society, and the problem that we face here is a breakdown of the current organization of society and whether some of these processes that are created are reversible or not. We talked about that with David Korowitz, the irreversibility concept. So the ability to offer credit in the future is going to be very dependent upon smaller political organizations forming up and controlling resources, and then once they have that control of those resources, then they can offer credit on them. But until such organizations form up, I don't see the possibility of issuance of credit, not during a breakdown phase. Not credit that would buy anything anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I would generally agree with that point. I think most of the credit creation arguments is something in the longer-term future. Once there will be a rebuilding phase at some point. It's just not in the near or medium-term future. Was there anything you wanted to add to this, Norman, or are you?
Yes, I picked up on the point, on Nicole's point about she seemed to think that we would top out at the Roman era. I'm inclined to agree with her on that. But the one point I'd like to throw out for comment is that at every era in the past, energy has always been purchased. You've had to buy energy from somewhere. It doesn't matter whether you buy a horse or whatever it is. You have to buy energy. We buy energy at the moment by digging it out of the ground. But if you have to buy it in Roman terms, you're buying people. Now, would anyone else like to throw in on that one? Because what I'm saying is, if you're buying people, you're buying slave labor. And I can't dress that up in any other way. If you top out at the Roman period being your top level of development, then the Roman society functioned on slave labor.
I will throw in on this.
Drastic.
because I've had this conversation before with people. Slaves are not energy; they're machines. They are utilizers of energy. They're burners of energy.
Yes, but
and
you get
the energy is the food in that situation. And whether it's for animal labor or human labor or whatever, the energy that you're using, your energy source is food. So your energy return on energy investment in that case is, can the slave produce more food and clothing and whatever it takes to keep said slave alive than he actually eats and needs. And when you get to the point at which the slave cannot produce as much as it's costing to keep him alive, the slave no longer has any value. And
Agreed.
then human life essentially becomes disposable at that point. And I think in a situation of overshoot like we're in, that you're getting to the point here, especially when the fossil fuels really do burn themselves out, that on an energy level of the amount of food that we can produce versus the energy that it takes for a biomass the size of currently 7 billion people, it's not productive, right? They're going to use more energy than they can help to grow out of the ground. So
Yes.
people become expendable, and that's what you see. That's what you see in the refugee crisis.
My point was that Nicole said we topped out at the Roman development level. That assumes a Roman development level of population as well, not the 7 billion we have now. You couldn't have a Roman development of society supported by 7. You couldn't support a 7 billion population. You would only have the Roman level of population.
Yeah, but you have to remember that the Romans functioned and built their society and their civilization by burning down forests all over the place, and then all of those areas that they were able to derive sustenance from and energy from, they essentially burned through them. And
yes.
In our downspin phase, are we not going to burn through just about everything that we've got sitting around? And so then it's even Roman level of civilization possible. And I would argue that we're going to spin down a lot further than that. But it will take some time. It's not going to happen overnight.
It's debatable.
Yeah.
So, do you have anything to say, Nicole?
Yes, when I say that Rome is where we would top out, I don't mean we would go down only to a Roman level. I mean the subsequent bubbles would only be able to rise to a Roman level at a rough maximum, but I think we'll be going down a lot further than that in the meantime. Because exactly as people have said, we have basically a long inch of people. So we're drastically over carrying capacity. Even as artificially inflated with fossil fuels, some 40% of the nitrogen in the food supply comes directly from fossil fuels as we remove the pinch point for the food supply. And we're going to see huge problems. And we are going to cannibalize carrying capacity on the way down, as Ari said, exactly as Rome did. All empires are based on Ponzi dynamics. They have to keep expanding in order to bring in, well, in the case of Rome, as people said, firewood, grain, slaves, all the sorts of things that you get when you take over new bits of territory. They were expanding out and bringing more and more back to the center in order to increase the socioeconomic complexity at the center to build up to the scale of empire that they had. But because empires are grounded in Ponzi dynamics, once they can no longer expand, the center will collapse. And then you have a period where the hegemonic power will shift, but there can be a very long interregnum while you have to regrow the forests that everybody cut down. It's a long time between periods of empire at that kind of scale. There's a long period in between where areas have to recover their carrying capacity. Some areas never do. The Fertile Crescent is a desert today. for instance. So we could be looking at a very long time before we can recover to the point where we can start to build anything that looks even like the Roman Empire. Again, I really am suggesting that this is a tremendous peak that we have a very long way to fall from. And I very much think that human life will be very cheap, sadly, on the way down when we have a lot more people than we have the capacity to feed. And it's true that if it costs more to feed someone than they are capable of producing through their labor, then that slave labor has no value. But I also agree that we are going to very likely see slavery on the way down, because it's not that there will be no circumstances under which people would be able to produce more value than it would cost to feed them. It's just that there will be fewer of those circumstances than there are now, by a large measure, I would argue. But I do think that the people who currently put themselves in the state of debt slavery have now volunteered to be the next generation of replacements for the energy slaves that we're no longer going to have access to. And this is one of the reasons that I have suggested for so many years that people get out of debt, because they really are volunteering for indentured servitude. And if you can't pay with money, they'll take your freedom. And I think we've only just begun to see the consequences of debt.
Yeah, of course. And I think one of the big problems I see in many economies is you've got a shortage of jobs and an abundance of people. So that naturally devalues life and how people are subsequently treated. But anyway, as interesting as this topic is, I just feel it's best to go back to the original topic, and that is about currency devaluation and market manipulation. And one of the questions that I wanted to talk about was again regarding the Chinese and the way that they have gamed their markets. And one of the things they've done is they've banned short selling, and in some cases selling entirely. And in the US, you have high-frequency trading programs that are regularly causing flash crashes in various sectors. And it's common for people to talk about manipulation in this area. The question is, how pervasive is it, and how long can it keep going to keep the system running? What are your thoughts on those kind of areas, Tom?
Well, I think we have to start where Confucius told us to start, by calling things by their proper names, and to even use the word market to describe the stock markets and commodity markets and the futures markets of this world is to misuse the name. They're not markets, they're casinos. People are in there playing with other people's money, playing with borrowed money. They're not buying for value. They're buying something that they're convinced they can get off to the next greater fool within the hour, and make their commission and go home. The value of things has been devalued entirely. The notion that people evaluate companies and invest their money to make money out of it is just hopelessly behind the times. And what we have are these people buying, selling short, selling long, buying indexes, buying default credit swaps, buying tranches of collected assets, so-called assets. And there's another word that is misused when applied to most of the things these people are bandying about. So to say the market is manipulated, that would be the best possible case. The market is rigged entirely, and it is a psychological gambling casino, with the further problem that now that we have the high-frequency traders that are making money off of the ability to detect a trade that's been entered and analyze that trade's effect on the market and execute 100 or 1,000 transactions that benefit from that trade before the trade is made, in the nanosecond while the trade is on the way to being made. That is just plain rigged. So what this has to do with delivering value and discovering prices and serving the capitalist system. I don't know. It has become totally corrupted and quite useless. In addition to everything else, this process of the gambling and the quick trades has blown up the values of everything to ridiculous levels. And we may be now seeing that correction, that dizzying drop on Thursday and Friday could be the beginning of a huge reset. But manipulation, it doesn't even get that good anymore. It's crazy. When you have General Motors valued at $59 billion and you have Google valued at $400 billion, you got a sick puppy. And getting out is the best advice anybody could give anybody on these markets. Somebody made a comparison one time about if you ask a high school student who's the prettiest girl in high school, you'll get one kind of answer. And if you ask them, who do you think the guys think is the prettiest girl in school, or who do you think the girls think is the prettiest girl, you'll get an entirely different kind of answer. And the question is being asked in the markets now is not what's going to make money, or what's a sound investment. What does everybody else think is a sound investment? And so we're getting these stampedes into housing and then into farm fields and into coal and out of coal and into oil and out of oil. It's a pretty dismal picture that we're looking at, and I don't think there's a fix other than the crash that seems to be upon us.
Yes, I think the longer term, that is the most likely scenario. But the way I see it and the way it's been going is there's no alternative, really. People have to invest their money somewhere, so all that money is channeled into fewer and fewer viable options. So, Google, like you mentioned, is one option, but, people are wary about other things like, there's less money in the retail. People aren't the real estate isn't as much as, people aren't as confident as they once were, although that is changing in certain areas, and that's an issue. But so it's two things really I see. It's confidence and a lack of viable returns. That's what's forcing people into marginal investments.
Excuse me, I want to object to that language because it's the language everybody's using. That all this money has been forced by the Fed to go into these implausible, high-risk junk bonds and investments. They were forced to do it. They had of course they had a choice. Nobody has to invest in anything. You can sit still and make 2% for a while until you find a worthy investment. They haven't been forced to do this. They have done it out of an almost suicidal mania to get higher returns than they can get from the traditional sources like government bonds.
Well, because government bonds are returning ZERP, right? They can't even get 2%. Yeah. So, it's every one of these agencies, whether it's a pension fund or whatever, has to meet a certain percentage, an expected percentage of return per year in order to be able to pay off their pension obligations, right? So, if you're only getting 0.5% or 1% on your treasury bonds, you got to find something else that you're going to get 7 or 8% on in order to meet your 5% total yield for your whole fund, depending on how you distribute it out. So they are, in a sense, forced into the game by their obligations, by the obligations they have to meet a certain level of return that they have promised. These are promises that have been made into the future of all types. And the concept all along the way is that there can be infinite growth. That's the expectation. That's where the 5% or whatever comes. That they figure, okay, 5% growth per year, and we can pay everybody off. But what does that mean? It means, I don't know what the doubling time on that one is, but it's probably like 30 years. and you can't just keep doubling. So this expectation that we could constantly get these kind of returns that have been expected is a sham. It's simply not possible. And the financial system eventually recognizes that. But before it does recognize it, you have this, what you call a mania, go on. You have these people who manage extremely large masses of money and who are expected to, get return on it in some way, some shape, some form, and by whatever means necessary. And so they start, as the number of good investments disappear, they start to invest in less and less worthwhile enterprises. And that's really what it boils down to. It's what Steve's talked about before too, is that the industrial economy is not remunerative. So as a result, what is there to really invest in, eh? If nothing is really going to pay a real return, then it's all a game of seeing how much debt you can raise. And that's basically what's gone on here for more than 150 years. I mean, really, since the railroads at least. They all went broke too, all these big enterprises go broke in the end. And all the debt ends up on the balance sheet of the central government or the taxpayer or whatever, however you want to put it. The losses are shifted from the tycoons, from the investors, to the population at large. But they always lose money. Everything does, because you're always burning energy up.
Yeah.
Well, okay. I think on that note, we'll close the economics segment of this conversation, and we still have most of us going strong. Hugo Bardi, who is in Italy, had to call it a night because it's probably close to midnight over there by now. And we still have a couple of folks in jolly old England with us who are starting to get late for them too, but I know Monster will make it through. I don't know about Norman. But we have another segment coming on the climate and geopolitics that are being affected here by all the stuff going on, and we'll be back for that in about 5 minutes. See you later, Doomers.